good day and welcome back. Well, I've done a lot of type-ins interfacing with the public in public typewriter gatherings, and one of the most common questions I'm asked is, can you still get ribbons for typewriters? And I'm always excited to share the idea that, yeah, you can still get ribbons. There's a number of companies selling not only ribbons, but bulk ribbons in large spools. Well, as it turns out, one of the main suppliers of bulk ribbons, Baco Ribbon, the proprietor of that business, she has passed away recently. We were saddened to hear. And therefore, Baco is out of business and we can't get bulk ribbons except from apparently one company still, Fine Line Ribbon in Texas, here in the United States. So if you're interested as a hobbyist, you have a number of typewriters, maybe dozens or even some people have hundreds of typewriters. It becomes more economical to have ribbons in a bulk supply, a large supply that you can wind onto the individual spools as you need them. So we're down to apparently one supplier for bulk ribbons now in the United States. And in the short term, that does not really hamper our hobby, our pastime, or our ability to use these machines, but it does bring to mind the fact that maybe the supply chain is a little bit more fragile than we thought, and going forward into the future, we don't know how the economy will play out in terms of the one remaining company supplying bulk ribbons and how the ribbon availability is going to work over time. So this all brings to mind the question of what are we going to do hypothetically if we no longer have especially cloth typewriter ribbons. Because our machines, many of them are built so solidly, engineered so well, that we know they'll last for the next 100 years. But they have to have ribbons for them in order to be useful as writing tools. So I have a few thoughts about this. Stay tuned. So recently, Richard Polt, the author of The Typewriter Revolution, published on his blog an interview that he had made with Charlene Oesch, who was the proprietor of Baco Ribbon, who recently passed away. And in that interview, it's a really interesting interview, she talks about in some detail about the kind of machinery and how a little bit of how the ribbon manufacturing works. And she did indicate in that interview that it is a difficult thing to get the ink spread evenly on the cloth ribbon. And her machine that she uses a series of rollers, and it's quite a bit more complicated than what a hobbyist might consider doing. So if you've ever tried hand inking a worn-out typewriter ribbon, you know that it's difficult. Even getting the right formulation of ink, right? So as I was thinking about this problem, what are we going to do if we run out of typewriter ribbons, especially cloth ribbons, but also film ribbons for Selectrics and daisy wheel machines? Is there a solution out there? And one of the thoughts that struck me was, hey, what about carbon paper? Is there a way to use carbon paper instead of a typewriter ribbon? Can you use carbon paper as a substitute for the ribbon? And I started experimenting with this a little bit, and I want to share with you the results. Well, I needed some carbon paper, first of all, to do this experiment. And, I had a pack of Staples brand carbon paper that had been hanging around the office here for years, and I hardly ever used it. And I think maybe 6 months ago or whatever, in a fit of cleaning, I tossed it. But then a few months ago, at a public typewriter meeting, somebody gave me this. And this is, well, it doesn't have the brand on it. It's a white cardboard envelope. It has a number 7530-00-244-4035, and that sequence of digits got me thinking that it looks like a federal stock number. It does say East Texas Lighthouse, Tyler, Texas, like maybe that was the company that had sold it to the government or whatever. So I did some searching and I found a website that resells government issue materials, and sure enough, yeah, it's government issue carbon paper. So anyways, I started using this stuff in an experiment, and one of the things that started this whole exploration of carbon paper is because I had been dissatisfied with the print quality from my Royal KMM, which is right over there. I've been unhappy with it. Like, if you use a really wet ribbon, the loops and the characters clog up. If you use a drier ribbon, the print quality is finicky on that machine. So let's come down here on the table and let's take a look at compare the quality of the KMM with its cloth ribbon onto paper versus carbon paper. Well, we'll start here with some newsprint paper. This is the Royal KMM. Imprint is just problematic. It's never really good quality. Anyway, that's what the standard imprint looks like on the KMM with a cloth ribbon. And this is the imprint using carbon paper. I'm using the newsprint paper you saw earlier. I'm using this on top of the carbon paper and then printing onto this regular printer paper behind the carbon paper. So one of the first things I noticed, there's several things. First of all, you can probably tell that the carbon paper gives a much darker imprint than the actual cloth ribbon itself, which is interesting. There's also, in terms of being a replacement for a ribbon, the carbon paper actually on the KMM, it does a better job, I think. It actually makes a darker imprint. However, you'll notice, perhaps, it's easy to see these streaks, these dark gray streaks, and these are from the feed rollers underneath the platen itself. There is this artifact from the feed rollers in the KMM because of the tension on the feed rollers. So that's a not so good thing. But if we're talking about the context of there's no more cloth ribbons being manufactured, hey, this actually looks like a solution. But there is one problem we have to address, which is when I was doing this test, I was typing onto the newsprint paper on top. That's what I was seeing, so I could see what I'm typing. But if we're going to talk about there's no more cloth ribbons left, how are we going to deal with the fact that we can't see what we're typing? If we just have carbon paper on top of regular paper, how do you see what you're typing? Well, you go back to the summer of 2008, the early days of the typewriter revival, and some of us typewriter bloggers were doing this little crafty thing of typing onto aluminum foil. What I did here later on was carbon paper with aluminum foil on top of it. And this is a way for you to be able to see what you're writing. As you're typing, you can see the embossment in the foil. And then you have the inky transfer onto regular paper as your finished product. I am still surprised the KMM seems to work better with carbon paper, at least compared to the ribbons that I'm using. Okay, so this was one example of aluminum foil as the top sheet to make your typing visible to you as you're typing, right? But then I wanted to try a different typewriter, so I switched to the Optima Super here, which has a thicker line weight of typeface. And looking at the transfer now, you can see that the Optima Super's imprint is lighter in shade, lighter in tone than the KMM. And I think the reason why is because pressure is force divided by unit area. And the wider line weights of the Optima Super's typeface means there's less pressure per unit area. So the transfer is lighter in tone. Whereas the KMM has a smaller typeface, the line weight is thinner, so there's more pressure and it transfers a darker imprint. So there's a difference between two different typefaces, two different machines. So I was not only interested in exploring typewriters and carbon paper for machines that use cloth ribbons, but what about daisy wheel machines that use film ribbon cartridges? And we know there's a number of daisy wheel machines out there that you can't get the cartridges for anymore. What about using carbon paper with them? Well, here's an experiment. This is the Nakajima WPT-150, a recently purchased new typewriter. And yes, the cartridges are still available for it. But this was an experiment. So this is the aluminum foil top sheet that I used with it. And where is the original carbon paper? The original carbon is underneath it like that. and then underneath that is the regular printer paper that the imprint was transferred to. And so you can see it makes a pretty decent imprint. So it doesn't look like the crisp, professional printer quality imprint directly from a carbon film cartridge. It looks more like a kind of a cloth typewriter imprint. Oh, I should mention that when I did this test, I took the film cartridge out of the machine. So this was the daisy wheels printing directly onto the carbon paper and then doing the transfer. So it looks pretty decent overall. I mean, it's usable. It's not quite as sharp as a first generation imprint directly to paper. I will mention, though, there were a couple really faint little roller marks from the pressure of the feed rollers in that machine making a transfer. So this appears to be a common problem using carbon paper so far with the machines I've tested it with. It does make a little bit of a streak, and that might be an artifact of the particular carbon paper that I'm using, the brand I'm using, right, this U.S. government carbon paper. But I didn't stop here. I have another test to share with you. What about Selectrics? Well, the Selectric that I have is the 721, which is a cloth cartridge style Selectric. And so, yeah, I rolled in some aluminum foil, and then I rolled with behind it a sheet of carbon paper, and underneath that a regular sheet of paper. So here's the embossed imprint from the Selectric, and you can pretty easily read that, actually. And then this is the imprint, nice and dark. It's actually really nice. It's darker perhaps than the actual ribbon that's currently in the cartridge itself that I normally use. So it looks like it's perfectly usable, but you will notice there is a faint streak of light gray from the feed roller pressure marks in the Selectric. So again, that seems to be a repeat problem and continuous problem using this particular brand of carbon paper with all the different machines that I've tried. So finally, this last test, this was using the Canon TypeStar 220s, which is a thermal typewriter, and I normally use thermal paper for it, but I was curious, can I use carbon paper with regular paper? And this is the result. It's not very good. There is this overall gray tone that is left because the print head apparently was either dragging on the carbon paper, or maybe there's actually a thermal transfer effect going on with the carbon paper, and it was just creating this dark gray background. So the contrast is really poor. The characters are not well defined. And so for thermal typewriters, as long as we still have thermal paper, that's the best solution to use. The lesson here is you probably don't want to use carbon paper with a thermal typewriter. So I started researching on Amazon about carbon papers, what kinds are available, and I found there's two general categories. The most common carbon papers available on Amazon are for tracing. This is for transferring drawings via the carbon paper onto other sheets of paper or canvas or art paper or even wood for woodworking or wood carving or wood burning. This particular brand was advertised as carbon paper for typing, and it is a little bit bigger in size. It is like, I think it's 8¼ by 13 inches, so it's even longer than an A4 sheet. So I'm going to have to experiment with this, and I don't know whether this is a waxy kind or a non-waxy kind of carbon paper, but I should mention that in Amazon, if you read the descriptions of the various carbon papers or transfer papers, there are kinds that they advertise specifically as being waxy, and other kinds they say are not waxy. And I think the difference is the non-waxy kind might be for transferring letters onto paper where you're going to be painting with a water-based wash, and you want to be able to cover up the transfer lines. And if it was a waxy impression, it would repel water and you wouldn't be able to cover up the lines, whereas the waxy kind of carbon paper might be better for things like woodworking, transferring designs to wood or whatever you're going to carve it or burn it in. So several different families of carbon paper available, a number of different brands, and a wide variety of price points. Let's do some more tests. Well, let's use, first of all, the Royal KMM, and then we'll use the Selectric 721, and we're going to compare the imprint from this legacy U.S. government carbon paper, then this carbon paper for tracing, and finally this other Tina brand carbon paper that's intended for typing. And I will be using aluminum foil as a top sheet, and then the carbon paper under test, and then finally a sheet of regular printer paper. And I should mention that the kind of aluminum foil I'm using are the kind that comes in the rectangles. Individual sheets of foil that are in rectangles. If you get the rolls of aluminum foil, it's a lot thicker. So the effect of the embossing effect and how much the force is transferred through from the foil through the carbon paper to the bottom paper, all that may be modulated by how thick the foil is. So this is much thinner foil, this one that comes in individual sheets. I've cut it down to these small sizes here. And for both the KMM and the Selectric, I'm going to set the machines to the stencil position so there won't be any cloth ribbon in the process. It'll be strictly be aluminum foil, carbon paper, bottom sheet of paper. So it'll be a consistent test. It's a little fiddly. Okay. Roll it in. And set the ribbon to stencil. Magic margin. Okay, let's put this now into the Selectric, and we'll continue the test. Yeah, it's a little fiddly, and this is one of the detriments to the post-apocalyptic typing scenario. Okay. Let's look at the results from these two machines with the legacy U.S. government carbon paper. Well, okay, let's get this sandwich unsandwiched. Here is the carbon paper. There's some holes punched through with a KMM, probably due to the hard platen. Okay, so here is the KMMs, and this was with stencil position, so it's directly onto the carbon paper and then onto the back sheet here. And yeah, it makes an imprint. Doesn't appear to be as good as the previous test that I did on the same kind of carbon paper. And then here is the Selectric and Bookface ACAD. Yeah, didn't type that well, but the Selectric has a nice dark imprint. But you'll notice both of these roller marks, these streaks going on, definitely is a detriment to the appearance of it. It looks like a little fingerprint mark. Not as good of an appearance using aluminum foil directly instead of paper on top of the carbon paper. But there it is. Let's now try this tracing paper in the same test on the same two machines. So we have fresh foil to type on. So consistent, the KMM has some punch through, probably a hard platen. All right. Okay. Well, it is consistent in the sense that the Selectric is printing darker than the KMM. KMM is surprisingly light. Let's compare the two. So on your left is the legacy U.S. government carbon paper, and on the right is this transfer paper designed for transferring drawings. And to me, it looks like this transfer paper on the right is just a little bit less dense, less dark of an imprint. This transfer paper does not appear to be waxy from just the feel of it, versus the legacy U.S. government paper is definitely a waxier feel. So that's probably one of the main differences, waxy versus non-waxy. I kind of like the waxy feel, at least the imprint is a little bit better, at least between the two. Well, we have, however, another paper to test. So U.S. government, the new transfer paper, and then this is the new carbon paper for typing. The carbon surface on this paper feels waxier than that transfer paper that I used previously. Okay. Well, okay, let's look at the results here. Looks like it's stuck together. There's our embossed. See what this looks like. Oh, definitely more holes in it. Not too bad. Let's compare it to the transfer paper for transferring images on the right. Both of these are new carbon papers. And it looks to me like this is definitely darker. I like the Selectric imprint. That's really nice. But the KMM's is actually surprisingly crisp and sharp. And I notice much less of the roller marks. Now I did try to pull the paper out with the pressure rollers relieved of pressure, and that might have helped. Here is the Legacy US Government paper, which is probably a little bit darker still, but slightly, but much more roller marks and much fewer roller marks on this kind of carbon paper, at least in this test. Yeah, I think that's acceptable. I could live with that. And this definitely feels a little more waxy than that other stuff here. But it's certainly one-time use only on the KMM or a manual typewriter with a hard imprint. So there's one more test I'd like to do, which is I'm going to redo the KMM test with that longer, waxier carbon paper, aluminum foil, printer paper underneath, but also a sheet of newsprint paper between the aluminum foil and the carbon paper. The idea being, it would help if I oriented the carbon paper properly. The idea being that maybe I can reduce the punch through on the carbon paper by having this sheet of newsprint paper. Maybe it might buffer the force a little bit better. Maybe this is something you could do if you have a hard platen in your machine. So a retest with a KMM with newsprint paper underneath the foil. And again, it looks like we've definitely punched a hole in the foil. So the foil is one-time use only. And it looks pretty nasty with bits of aluminum foil stuck in the newsprint paper. And it looks like we still have significant punch through on the carbon paper. But, wow, it actually looks darker. Now, I was not typing any harder. Significantly better darkness of imprint with a sheet of paper on top of it. Maybe it's just spreading the force out better. And it's the same long sheet of the new carbon paper, same sheet. So there you go. As far as the roller marks, well, there's a little bit up here. There is a thumbprint from probably me pressing on it. So there's probably a little bit, yeah, actually my thumb is dirty. That's probably just me handling it afterwards. But yeah, not bad. There's a couple little smudge marks. So you might have to experiment with whether or not you want to use a buffer sheet of paper underneath your aluminum foil or not. It might depend on your individual typewriter. Okay, I'm doing another test here, impromptu. So this was the original test using the inexpensive image transfer paper, the one that had the rather faint impression on the KMM. I've redone that test now with a fresh sheet of the same paper, but I'm using a sheet of newsprint between it because I saw an improvement with using newsprint using the Tina brand, and there is still some punch through on the foil. There's definitely some punch through on the paper, yeah, and the carbon paper does have some holes in it as well, but it looks like there's significantly darker impression if you're using a sheet of newsprint or some kind of thin paper underneath the foil. So for some reason, that gives you a darker imprint. You would think it would be the opposite. You would think that without another layer of paper, it would be darker. And yeah, there is a little bit of roller mark impressions that you can see. The roller mark might be slightly fainter using the newsprint paper versus not, but the imprint itself of the characters is darker, which is a good thing. I think it's a good thing for us to compare the density of the carbon paper films themselves. So I'm trying to backlight it with this light back here, but try not to get too much light on the front side. This is the Legacy U.S. Government carbon paper. It's moderate. I think you can see a little bit of the image behind it, so the film density is not entirely really dark, but it does appear to be definitely thicker than this image transfer paper, the inexpensive stuff I bought off Amazon. That is really thin. You can see streaks from probably manufacturing variabilities or whatever in it, so not so great. And then the Tina brand, intended for typing, appears to be the thickest. I can't even see it. It looks almost completely opaque. Well, that's really what you're looking for. Let's talk about the cost for the carbon paper per sheet. Well, first of all, this stuff right here, Legacy U.S. Government carbon paper, there are resellers of government issue materials online. You can find these. This particular paper, which is tracing transfer carbon paper for tracing and drawing, is 13 cents per sheet in the 100 sheet pack, and it's A4 size. And then this Tina brand is F4 size, and it's also a 100 count pack, and it amounts to about 14 cents per sheet in this 100 count pack. So it turns out that both of these are about the same cost, but I think for typing, this brand is much better than the other brand. It gives a darker imprint. Well, to summarize here, in general, when you're looking at new carbon papers available on places like Amazon online, you have your selection of waxy and non-waxy, and I think a lot of the non-waxy pages, carbon paper sheets, are intended for art transfer, where you don't want waxy lines on your canvas, which would repel water-based inks. Those appear to not be as dark when you're using it with a typewriter, and so at least this one brand, the Tina brand, seems to be pretty good for typing. They do also sell this in blue, by the way. And then there's also other brands that I didn't experiment with that are much more expensive, like Pelican. This Tina brand seems to work okay. It is depends on whether your manual typewriter platen is really hard or not, as to whether you can get multiple passes out of it. And of course, being able to see what you're typing, this little makeshift idea of using aluminum foil, it seems kind of weird, but if this is the future that we're preparing for, where there's no more typewriter ribbons, it's going to be different. And maybe there's a better idea than using aluminum foil, or maybe perhaps using the thicker foil that comes in the rolls instead of the sheets. That would give you a different modulation of force. But there is a variation in print quality here. These two right here that we looked at on the same carbon paper, between using newsprint paper underneath the foil and not. So there is room for experimentation. I guess the answer to my question is, can we still use typewriters in the future when we run out of ribbon manufacturing and all the new old stock is sold out? And the answer is, yeah, you can kind of do it with carbon paper and some method of making visible your marks, maybe aluminum foil. And also, if you have a better idea than aluminum foil for seeing what you are typing on, I guess you could just type a line and then roll the paper up and peel the carbon paper back and look and see what you did. But that's kind of like blind typing. That's like having a blind typewriter from the late 1800s, right? There you go. Carbon paper, a little bit about the different kinds, and yeah, you can use it in place of a ribbon. It's just a little more fiddly, but if typing direct to paper is important to you, it might be important to figure out how you can do that. And with that, I'll leave you, and I wish you the very best in your creative activities. Have yourself a great day. Bye-bye for now.